Welcome back to another episode of Green Leif TV. I'm your host, Leif Skogberg, and in this episode we're going to be talking about one of the most amazing plants on the planet. This is Theobroma cacao. This is the chocolate tree. Most people in North America and in Europe have never actually seen a cacao tree growing, and the reason for that is because these plants, these trees, only grow in a very specific region on the planet. They only grow at about 20 degrees north of the equator or 20 degrees south of the equator. So it's a very specific region and climate zone that these cacao plants can grow. Right now I'm here on the big island of Hawaii at a place called the Hawaiian Sanctuary, which is a small cacao farm. They have about 140 cacao trees. And here in the background you can see one of their big specimen trees that has a variety of ripe and unripe cacaos on it. You can see the simple leaf shape on these cacao. It's quite beautiful, and then the new leaf growth has this nice red hue to it. So one of the things I wanted to share with you today is just a brief overview of how this amazing plant gets used all over the world and how this cacao pod gets turned into the chocolate that you enjoy from your local stores and restaurants. So this right here is a more of a ripe cacao pod. This one has, if you scratch the top of it here, you can see that it's nice and orange underneath there. And it's also the same on the bottom. This is how you can tell if your cacao pod is ripe, by simply giving a little scratch test there to see if it's orange. If it's still green like this one right here, you can see underneath there, that's still green, that's not ripe. So this one I just picked as a demonstration to show you what's ripe and what's not ripe. And what happens is when these cacao are ready to be harvested, what they do is they harvest the ripe pods of course, and they break them open. Sometimes they break them open with machetes, but one of the techniques I was taught that keeps the beans on the inside intact and keeps them from breaking open is to simply hit them together. And what you do when you break them open is you have this amazing, beautiful, gelatinous, sort of mucilaginous white paste on the inside here. This delicious, so good. It's sweet and slimy. It's really refreshing, really watery. This pulp around the bean pod is often used to make a fermented alcoholic drink with about 5% alcohol in it. Some people refer to that as ambrosia. It's delicious. My kids and I will just snack on this stuff, this pulp, for hours. It's amazing. So good. First time I had it here when I came to the big island of Hawaii and got to meet Theobroma, food of the gods, directly and in person. So what happens is these cacao beans and pulp get put into a container, usually a wooden box that's been lined with banana leaves. Sometimes people use like a food grade plastic or different kinds of boxes, but there's a whole science to the size and dimensions of the box. And what happens is they throw it all in there with this pulp and everything, and it begins to ferment. And depending on the variety of cacao, there's a whole bunch of different varieties. Most common one for cacao production in the world is known as Forastero variety. But one of the other one that's really highly valued as a gourmet heirloom variety crop, which this one is more closely related to, is Criollo variety. It makes really high quality chocolate that doesn't need as much sugar because it doesn't contain as much of the bitterness. But so anyway, what you do is you take this cacao bean and pulp, you put it into a box that's lined with banana leaves, and you let it ferment. That's actually, I didn't realize, the first process in making chocolate from the cacao bean and the pod is to ferment the pulp and the bean together in a box. Once that happens for about 3 to 10 days, again depending on the variety and the amount of bitter content in the bean that needs to be fermented out. Once you do that process, then the beans are taken out, the liquid, actually the pulp liquid goes down to the bottom, and you can pull that off as what some people call ambrosia, and that can be fermented and made into this amazing alcoholic drink. So then after the fermentation process is complete, what you do is you dry out the bean pod, and that can either be done in a solar dryer, or it can be done in the inside of a closed space, a electric dryer, or a variety of different ways. Once you've fermented the beans and the pulp, you dry it out in a dehydrator. Usually the traditional method is out on racks of kind of these sheets of fiber and cloth that are out in the sun, and you rake the beans and you keep circulating and rotating them so they dry out evenly. You don't want any mold to set in there. Once they've been dehydrated or dried out with a solar dryer, or like I said, an electric one. Some people do it when you're in a really rainy climate like this in the Puna district of the Big Island of Hawaii, where it's basically a rainforest. It's not very easy to use solar dryers, so the context is really going to define how you can dry it. But once you've dried the bean, then it's ready to be shipped. And even sometimes one of the traditional methods that's used when they dry the bean, they also coat it with a clay, sort of a clay slip or a clay water, which helps preserve the bean after it's dried when it's being shipped to different parts of the world to be made into chocolate. So the next step after the bean has been dried out is that it gets either shipped, or if it's being made into chocolate like it is here on this farm, what they'll do is they'll put it through a nibber, which also takes off the shell. So it's a process of winnowing and removing the thin outer shell of the cacao, which by the way makes a wonderful tea. The shell of the cacao can be made into this delicious tea. But then you take the nibs that come out of the winnowing and the crushing process and deshelling process, and those nibs are what get used to make cacao butter and cacao liquor, which it's a very complicated and specific process of processing the nibs to make chocolate. But basically, in essence, after you have the nibs, it's ground down and mushed into a paste, and sugar and cacao butter is added, and it's emulsified and turned into this, this whipped into this nice, smooth, velvety material, which is usually sweetened, and sometimes with the varieties that have less bitterness, you need a lot less sugar, or maybe you can use a stevia sweetener, things like that. But it has to be a dry, powdered form of sweetener. You can't put like agave syrup or honey or any liquid, no maple syrup. You can't put liquid into the cacao butter and paste and nibs as you're smoothing it out and going through this process of getting it to be nice and consistent and smooth and velvety. If you put liquid into it, it'll just gum it up and it'll cause problems. So it has to be a powdered sweetener. So powder, like sugar crystals, or coconut sugar, or stevia, or a variety of different things can be used to sweeten your cacao. And then once it's mixed and smoothed and created into this nice velvety, pure consistency, then the cacao can be poured out into what you know as a cacao bar or chocolate, or a coating on an almond or a raisin, or what other methods and ways of making a chocolate product. So there you have it, taking the ripe cacao pod of the Theobroma cacao tree and turning it into chocolate. That's the basics of it. It's a whole art and a science, and there's an amazing diversity of cacao varieties that are now coming out of different parts of the world. If you grow a cacao for many generations on one climate, on one site, in one area, it's going to evolve and adapt, and you can crossbreed the different varieties and come up with all these new and interesting different strains of cacao. Even though the birthplace of cacao is in South America, in the foothills of the Andes and in the Amazon Valley, most of the cacao today, 70% of the cacao made into chocolate today, is produced in West Africa, which is another one of those regions of 20% south or 20% north of the equator that you can grow cacao commercially. Here in Hawaii, on the Big Island of Hawaii, in the Puna district where we're at right now today, it's about 19.5 degrees, so it's right along that 20-degree mark. And I was amazed when I found out that not only is there a variety of different companion plants that you can mix in with your cacao trees. One of them is called Gliricidia, which is known as the mother of cacao. It's a nitrogen-fixing legume tree that's used as a chop and drop and cut back, and also as a nurse tree that grows up fast and high up above the cacao when you're first getting it planted. But there's also vanilla bean, which is an amazing companion plant for the chocolate. Who would have thought vanilla and chocolate growing together? So this right here is the cacao flower, and you can see how the pods just grow right there on the trunk and sprout out from the flowers just like that. This incredible, delicate, almost orchid-looking flower on there. You can see all these baby cacao pods growing up here in the inside under the shade on the trunks. Right here is the vanilla vine growing up the tree here, coming down, then it hangs down over on this side. It's hanging down right here, and this is where you'll get your vanilla flower right there, and eventually your vanilla pod. Pretty cool, huh? This vanilla bean epiphyte, it's a plant that's just growing right on the tree of the cacao. It's like an epiphytic vine that's growing up inside of it, and the flowers come off, and it creates these vanilla bean pods, similar to the pod, much smaller. It's just this small, skinny little pod, but it is very similar in the sense that it's also a pod. And that's how the vanilla spice, the vanilla flavor, is grown. So anytime we can add more diversity, more unique, plant synergistic relationships, the better. And we also have some pea grass. You probably can't see it, but there's some of this pea grass down here on the ground. This one right here, that's a good nitrogen fixing ground cover here. Here's one of the flowers of the pea grass. It's a beautiful little edible flower that grows here as a ground cover around the cacao. So some of the companion planting that's being used with these cacao here at Hawaiian Sanctuary on the Big Island of Hawaii. And we've also planted, as I was mentioning, these Gliricidia trees. We've planted them at strategic locations between these young cacao trees. There's this new orchard that we're growing, planting out here. And we have these mother of cacao Gliricidia support nurse trees that are growing up in between the cacao to help shade them in their initial years of getting established, and be cut, chop and drop trees to feed the soil, to reduce the weeds, and to improve the overall resilience and ecological system functioning of this area.